Hi, good day. Welcome to part 1 of 6 of reproduction for the CSEC, our CSEC HSB syllabus. And of course, it will also be very, very useful for the integrated science syllabus. So let's go straight into it. Now, before we actually jump into reproduction, I just want to clear up some words that you might be hearing, because I don't want the words to scare you when I use them in the slides. So the first word, the first 3 words that I'm going to introduce is DNA, genes, and chromosomes. These 3 words are usually used interchangeably, and a lot of people think that DNA, genes, and chromosomes are the same exact thing. But there is a slight difference between these 3 words. Let's start off with the middle word, genes. And the reason I'm starting with this word, it's because it's more likely, that everyone here has heard the word genes. Now, what are genes? Genes are what give us our look. Like if you look at different people, different people have different color eyes, different shapes of ears, different size of nose. People have different body structures. So genes determine how we will look. In other words, genes is like a plan. So our body will know how to build itself. So, but what's the connection now? Now that we have a basic idea of what genes are, well, let me explain where genes fall within these 3 words. We're going to start off with a cell. Now, we all know a cell has a nucleus. Inside the cell, inside here, there's something called chromosomes. Your chromosomes, well, they look something just like this. I want you to think of chromosomes as a piece of cloth. Obviously, if you look at a piece of cloth underneath a microscope, a piece of cloth is made up of smaller parts, usually thread. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take the piece of cloth, which is the chromosome, and unravel it. So you pull all the individual threads out of the cloth. That long strand of thread that was making up the entire chromosome, that's your DNA. If you take a certain section of the thread, in other words, a certain section of your DNA, we call that a gene, right? So a gene is a section of the thread. And when you put the whole thread together, you get something called a chromosome. Now, when I'm choosing to describe this, remember the chromosome is which contains our genes, will determine how our body looks, right? It should be known that in the human body, there are 46 chromosomes. So right now, I have 46 chromosomes in me. You have 46 different types of chromosomes in you. All right. So when I'm choosing to use these 3 words there, I'm going to be using the words chromosomes, right? I'm not going to be using the word genes or DNA for today's lecture. Right. And we have a little definition here. Genes, well, chromosomes are inside the genes. So basically, chromosomes and genes, determine how our body look and develop. All right. So that's the first thing I wanted to clear up. The next thing that I want to clear up is how cells multiply. Well, when you and I were now conceived, we were just one tiny cell, believe it or not. But we know that our body is made up of trillions of cells. So that means that one cell, which is what we started at, multiplied over time to become trillions of cells, which is us. right? When cells multiply or make copies of themselves, there are two different ways they can multiply. And I just want to clear up briefly explain the two different methods and the names of those methods. I want you to pretend that this circle here is a cell. I mentioned a few minutes ago that a cell, well, humans have 46 chromosomes. When it's time for this cell to multiply, this is what will happen. Look at what's going to happen. This cell is going to magically, well, magically, right? There's a lot of science behind it, right? It was split into two cells. In other words, one cell created a clone of itself. And you notice something. Each cell still has how much? 46 chromosomes. You call this process mitosis. And these two cells are basically identical to each other. It's like in those sci-fi movies. When somebody makes a clone of you, your clone looks exactly like you. The same thing with cells. The cell, using this process of mitosis, makes an exact copy of this cell. And then what will happen? These two cells will make copies of themselves, and then the process just repeats itself until you get 1,000,000,000,000 cells, okay? The other way it can happen is this. You have a cell with 46 chromosomes, but when it decides to make a copy of itself, this is what happens instead. You get two cells, but you all notice something? Each cell that was made from the original cell did not end up with 46 chromosomes in each. Instead, if you realize 46 divided by 2 is 23. Instead, the new cells that have been made have half the amount of chromosomes. So even though the cell is multiplying and they're getting twice the amount, unfortunately, the chromosomes are reduced to half, which is 23 in humans. You call this process meiosis, right? Now you probably figured out why I needed to explain this at the beginning of class. Because a lot of students, you can imagine how they will mix up the word mitosis with meiosis. The words are so similar. But there's a very easy way to remember. Mitosis has the letter I in it, right? Well, the letter after the M, right? The I stands for identical. So the mitosis, both of them, both cells that are created are identical to each other and even have the same exact amount of chromosomes. Meiosis, that's the one with the E after the letter M, only has what? Half. Okay? So you're going to hear me using these words, chromosomes and mitosis and meiosis. So let's go straight into the next slide. Right? Of course, feel free to make as much notes, pause the videos and do what, right? Notes are very important. All right, so the next thing we're going to go to, there are actually two types of reproduction. Now, in case you didn't, you didn't know, reproduction is when an organism or organisms, plural, try to make a copy of itself, or it tries to create a new organism, right? But there are two types. One called sexual reproduction, that's the one in red here, and the other one is asexual reproduction, right? Let's start off with asexual reproduction. That's this one here. And let me change the color here to blue so I can, keep it color coded for you guys. So asexual reproduction actually involves one parent. There's only one organism. Now that's completely the opposite of sexual reproduction. It's probably common knowledge by now. Sexual reproduction requires two persons, a male and a female. But Some organisms, not humans, obviously, some organisms reproduce asexually, meaning that they can reproduce on their own. They do not need a second organism or a partner to replicate itself. So asexual involves one parent only. This word here, gametes, are not produced. If you don't know what gametes are, right? Gametes are in humans, right? The two examples of gametes are sperm, which comes from the male, and the females have an egg. In sexual reproduction in humans, the gametes are the sperm and the egg, which means the sperm needs to come in contact with the egg. In asexual reproduction, there's no such thing as sperm and eggs. They are just simply not required for the organism to reproduce. And if you're probably wondering, well, what type of organism reproduces asexually? Well, the most common example would be bacteria, right? One bacteria, if you put one bacteria inside a test tube and there are no other bacteria around, come back a few hours later, there will be probably 1,000,000 of them inside there because one bacteria can reproduce by itself, right? Now, here's the thing. The offspring that's created by asexual reproduction, the offspring, which is a child, looks exactly like the parent. So it practically makes a clone of itself. We know that's not true with humans. With humans who use sexual reproduction, right? If a male and a female, a mother and a father have a child, the child doesn't look exactly like the father, and the child obviously doesn't look exactly like the mother. It may have some resemblance, right? But it's not exact. The only way to get an exact copy of the parent is to have one parent, and of course, asexual reproduction is what you would require for the offspring to look exactly like the parent. And here's that fancy word. Well, a version of the fancy word. In asexual reproduction, right? The type of cell divisions, the method in which the cells of the organism multiply or replicate is mitotic, right? Which obviously comes from the word mitosis. And you see the letter I here. So when you see the letter I here, every time the cells replicate or make a copy of itself, it's an exact copy. So if, I'm just saying, if one of the organisms, if the particular organisms had 40, I just guessing a number here, 48 chromosomes, when it replicates itself or clones the cell, the next one will also have exactly 48 chromosomes. All right? So here's a nice little summary here in this little blue box here of everything that's asexual. And then when we go to sexual reproduction now, you're going to realize it's just almost the opposite of asexual. And this one is pretty probably common knowledge by now for most persons, right? It involves two organisms, a male and a female. Gametes are produced. So the male will produce what? Sperm, and the females will produce eggs. That's your gametes, right? You need those two things for sexual reproduction. The offspring, right? The offspring, which is the child, right, looks different, right? And the technical word for that is genetic variation, right? Genetic variation. That's a fancy term for, hey, the child looks a little bit different from the parents, and it's not an exact copy of the parent, okay? Right. Now, here's the thing. The gametes, which are the sperm and eggs, they are actually produced by meiotic division. This is the one with the letter E after the letter M, which means when these cells divide, they only have half the amount of chromosomes. So if the original cell, before it duplicated itself or cloned itself or split into two, however you want to say it, had 46 chromosomes, after it splits into two, each cell will have 23 chromosomes. All right? Right. And of course, this word here, the zygote, right? I'm not going to explain this right now. Actually, let me explain it right now, just to get over with. How about it works? In the females have what? Eggs. So we have an egg, and of course, males produce sperm, right? When the sperm and the egg meet, in other words, when the sperm goes into the egg, right? You call that a zygote, right? So, but I'm going to be explaining that a little later on in more detail, and I'll keep refreshing your memory on that. All right, so here's a nice little summary of what sexual reproduction is in case they ask you in the exam. And of course, if they just want a little summary of the entire sexual reproduction process. All right, so you all know what to do. Pause the video, take down the entire table, learn it off by heart for the exam. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, right? I'm not trying to make these videos not too long. That's why I broke it up into 6 parts. All right, so now, excuse me. So now we're going to look at the different parts of the male and female reproductive organs, right? So here we have two scientific, biological pictures, right? We're gonna, like I say, be describing each one in detail and learning off the different parts. So let's move on. All right. But before we do that, I just want to show you two more detailed diagrams of the human gametes. Remember, the males produce sperm. And if you were to zoom in on sperm underneath a microscope, I guess, you will see that the sperm is made up of two main pieces, the tail and the head. Inside the head, remember, at the end of the day, a sperm is a sex cell. Key word here is cell. And most cells will have things like the mitochondria, a nucleus, all the normal parts of the cell. But I didn't draw any mitochondria and whatnot, right? You're not gonna need to draw that for the exam. But a sperm has a nucleus, and if they ask you in which part of the sperm is the nucleus located, it's located in the head. And here's the thing. Sperm cells only have 23 chromosomes, but I mentioned that a little while ago in the table before. Remember, sperm cells are created through meiosis, right? That's the one with the E. So when these cells split, right, or when they are in the process of being created, they only get half the amount of chromosomes. So once again, half of 46 is 23, right? And so take your time, draw the diagram of the sperm and whatnot. Here have the uses of each part. Like if in the exam, if they ask you, hey, what's the function of the tail? And that's an official question that I saw come before, right? What the tail does, it goes from side to side, right? It helps the sperm swim, right? Right. And the female sex cell, right, is called an egg or ovum, right? The more popular word is egg. Most likely you're not going to be seeing the word ovum, but some people call it the ovum. So here's a nice little detailed diagram of the female sex cell. And the female sex cell is created by meiosis. Once again, it will only have 23 chromosomes in it, right? And have the membrane, the nucleus is what contains the chromosomes. You have some cytoplasm and a jelly-like coating around it to protect it and whatnot. Now, here's the thing, right? It should be obvious by now, but I'm still going to say it. You have 46 chromosomes. You right now, me and you, we both have 46 chromosomes. Guess where we got the 46 chromosomes from? Sperm contains 23. So the father would have how you say, contributed 23 chromosomes, and the mother would also have what? 23 chromosomes. So when a sperm enters into the egg, the 23 from the sperm and the 23 that's already in the egg, they add up to give you your 46 chromosomes. Okay? Most of you all probably figured that out before I said it. But anyway, let's move ahead. Let's move ahead. Okay? Right. So I just want to pause here just for a little while. All right. So on the screen here, we have a detailed diagram of the male reproductive system. Now, don't get scared by all these fancy words that you are seeing. All right? The truth is, in a CSEC HSB exam or even integrated science, they just basically ask you like the most popular ones will be this here, right? So the male reproductive organ has the testes. We're going to see the use of all of these parts just now. The urethra, right? Now, if you look at this, right, the urethra is connected, right, at the end of the day to your bladder. Now, your bladder is what holds your urine, okay? But your testes will produce sperm. The sperm will be sent along these tubes here. Now, and these tubes are called your vasa deferens, right? Well, plural differential, right? So I have a table just now I'm going to show you that will show you all the different functions of all these different parts, right? My advice to you, this is pretty difficult to draw. My advice would be to just to take a screenshot and you could probably print it out. But for those of you who are pretty good at drawing, well, you could take a shot and draw it. But anyway, let's move to the next slide where you can see the uses of all of these parts and you can see the diagram as well. So I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but here are all the different parts and all the different functions. Right. And in case you don't know what the scrotum is, well, that's a, how I say, well, I have the description here, right? It's a bag of skin that holds and helps protect the testicles, right? Testes and testicles are the same thing, right? So the testicles need to be outside the body, right? It has to do with the temperature. If it's inside your body, the temperature is be too high, and of course, it will not be able to produce sperm. So outside your body is a little bit cooler. All right, so once again, I'm going to keep reminding you all, pause the video, take down the entire table, right? And if, let's just say if, you don't have time to learn off every single thing on this table. If I had to recommend 4 things to learn, because I've seen these questions come over and over in the exam, I would recommend that you learn off this one, this one, this one, and this one. Those 4, right? But obviously all of them are on the syllabus. I'm just pointing out the ones that I notice come up more frequently than the others. Okay. All right, so let's move on. Right, and here's the female reproductive system, right? So over here you have the entrance to the female reproductive system, that's the vagina, right? There is obviously a difference between the uterus and the vagina. Above the vagina in this area here, that is your uterus. And the kind of division or the pathway that kind of separates the uterus from the vagina is the cervix. telling you this because I've seen these questions come in the exam. And I have a good feeling that the examiner knows that people mix up those three things. This part here is called your ovary. Guess what your ovary does? Well, in females, it produces the eggs. And of course, when the eggs are produced in the ovary, they do not stay in the ovary. They get ejected out or pushed out. And the eggs, they basically will move along this tube called the fallopian tube. And you see this guy here, the fallopian tubes, we're going to be talking about him constantly, right? And eventually, the egg will make its way out of the fallopian tubes and it will go into the uterus area. But when it reaches into the uterus area, that's a discussion for another video. All right, so let's move to the next slide that has all the different parts here. And of course, it has the diagram to your left and the table with all the parts, and of course, the functions of all the parts, right? I already summarized it to make it as easy as possible to understand, right? Pause the video, draw it, take down the table. You all know what to do by now. Let me just move this here. Thing is blocking this. All right. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. Right. So here we have the summary of sexual development. Let's compare males with females. At birth, right, males are born with testes. Now, testes, as you'll remember from the previous slide, will produce the sperm. Now, while babies have testes, the testes cannot make sperm as yet, right? You have to reach, and the baby has to at least, well, it has to reach a section in its life called puberty, which usually starts between 12 to 14 years. There's this gland that's in your brain called the pituitary, oh, well, I'm tight tongue, so please forgive me, gland, right? And what this gland does, it produces a hormone. Now, if you all don't know what a hormone is a chemical. Your body has many different types of hormones. And what hormones do, they travel about your body and they tell your body to do certain things, right? Different hormones, when it reaches certain parts of your body, will tell that part of the body to do something. For example, there's this popular hormone called adrenaline. Whenever you are in danger, you hear someone get a surge of adrenaline. Adrenaline is this hormone that makes you more alert and it gives you more energy so that you have a better chance of survival in a very dangerous situation. So the pituitary gland produces this type of hormone called the gonad stimulating hormone. Now, this only happens during puberty, sorry. And it will send these hormones to the testes. Now, when the testes receives this particular hormone, right, the testes now will start making another set of hormones. So it comes like this. The pituitary gland sends a hormone to the testes, and when the testes receives that hormone, it starts to make hormones of its own called androgens. And of course, it's at this point the testes start producing sperm. Now, here's the thing. These hormones, right, the androgens, its main function is to get the testes to start producing sperm. So that's the main use of the androgens. However, there's a little something called secondary sexual characteristics. These secondary sexual characteristics have actually nothing to do with sexual reproduction. A sexual characteristics is just something that comes about the main one being accomplished. So secondary sexual characteristics is like this. the growth of body hair. When a male reaches puberty, they start to grow beard and mustache and whatnot, and their voice changing. Now, these things actually have nothing to do with with reproduction, right? The main thing here is that the testes has start producing sperm, because the sperm is the important part of reproduction, right? So the puberty, well, once a person passes puberty, nothing interesting happens here. But usually around 70 or 75 years, males cannot produce sperm anymore, right? So the body is unable to make it after that point. Let's look at the females now, right? So at birth, ovaries containing immature eggs are present in the abdomen, but they do not produce eggs yet. So it's like an immature version of an egg, right? So obviously babies cannot obviously get pregnant because their eggs are not ready to be fertilized as yet, right? So, but what happens during puberty? That's between 12 and 14 years. So once again, the pituitary gland comes into play. It produces something called a gonad stimulating hormone. It will send this hormone to the ovaries. When the ovaries receive that particular hormone, it's the ovaries now will itself start to produce another hormone called estrogen. Yes, the O is silent. Estrogen, right? And it's at this point the ovaries start producing eggs. These are eggs that can now be fertilized. The things that the secondary sexual characteristics now is that women usually start to grow breast, and they for some reason accumulate fat on their thighs. At age 45 to 50, something called menopause happens. And it's at this point females cannot produce any more eggs. So usually between 45 and 50 years old, around that age, women cannot have children, right? And there are some exceptions to the rule, right? So you've read stories and whatnot, but the age of 45 to 50 is when the majority of women stop producing eggs and hence cannot have children. All right, guys, you all know the drill. Take down the table, right? Learn it off by heart. Okay? And guys, that brings us to the end of part 1 of 6. I will be creating part 2 of 6, hopefully in very, very soon. All right, guys, so take care. And I hope, this explained a lot to you guys. Take care.